Hi, welcome. So I am Professor Jennifer Schuba from the International Studies Department, and I also teach in the Environmental Studies and Sciences program here at Rhodes, and I'm beginning my 11th year. And in that time, I've seen so many different changes in terms of the way that the world outside, all of the problems that we face, really come out as pressures on students in terms of how can I change the world? How can I make a difference? What should I even study? What are even the problems that are out there? And in the nexus of the kinds of courses I teach between international politics and environmental studies, there's so much of, so many different issues that cross both of those disciplines. And I was really motivated to talk to our special guest today, Dr. Cary Fowler, about how those things come together, because I see in his career a person who has really meshed those fields quite well himself. And so what we're doing today is a conversation. And I'm actually not going to give you the traditional bio for Dr. Fowler as we begin, but our conversation itself will be the bio. So let's begin. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
One of the things that you and I have talked about offline is when we're young, we think about what we're supposed to be majoring in, what we're supposed to be studying, and what we want to be when we grow up. I'm still not sure what I want to be when I grow up, but instead, maybe a better way to think about it is what kind of problems do we want to solve in the world? And that's what I always tell my advisees when we meet across the desk. Well, what kind of problems do you want to solve in the world? And you've articulated that in your idea of doing something, not being something. So as you got interested in these issues about food and agriculture, early on in your life, what kind of problems did you latch onto? What did you see in the world that motivated you to get into these kinds of fields?
Well, I think, in the beginning, the area of agriculture resonated with me. This is post-Rhodes, because I grew up loving my grandmother and my grandmother loving me, and she had a farm in Madison County, Tennessee. So somehow when I came across that, the realization that that agriculture was more than planting fields and driving tractors, because I knew I wasn't going to do that. That there were political dimensions to it, there were ethical and justice questions involved and environmental questions. It resonated with me very deeply because I'm kind of drawn to complexity, and I like issues and problems that don't have a straight solution. I like to play around with ideas. So I got involved with a journal called Southern Exposure, put out by the Institute for Southern Studies. And I also love my homeland. I grew up in Memphis, so I'm a Southerner. And we had an issue about agriculture in the South, and I kept complaining that there wasn't a certain kind of article about what was happening to small farmers in the South, namely they were going out of business. And finally, the other people in the magazine staff turned to me and pointed their finger and said, "You write it." And I did, and that was the beginning of this whole career, so to speak.
So very much identifying a problem and then ending up building a career about that in all of its twists and turns over time.
I was never personally very career-oriented. I never had a desire, as you kind of alluded to be something. I didn't want to be a doctor or a professor or a congressman or this or that. I wanted to do certain things. And I figured I'd kind of end up doing a lot of different things in my life. And when I first latched onto this particular issue that I've worked on, which is conserving crop diversity, I thought, well, that's a really, for me, it was a fascinating issue. It brought in every academic discipline, just about every one. And I thought, well, this is really great. I think I'm going to read a bit more about this and study it a little bit, and I'll probably spend 2 months on this one. And that was
a while ago.
About 40 years ago. And I'm still there.
You didn't solve it yet? I mean,
No, it's so slow.
Well, speaking about crop diversity as the main issue, in your different roles over time, it sounds like you've used some language that we use in our courses, and so I'm going to kind of speak to the students here. We talk about securitizing things. We talk about food security or human rights. How did you find over the years certain ways of framing that issue get the most traction with policymakers? In what ways could you describe the problem in a way that gets people's attention?
Well, that's a really complicated question. In the beginning, when I was working on this issue, nobody I knew anything about the issue. The issue, in a nutshell, was the loss of genetic diversity, the loss of variety in agricultural systems. And we need that diversity because the diversity is the raw material for evolution in our agricultural crops, for plant breeding and such. So, for example, you might think that Wonder Bread or whatever variety of bread you like is made with the same variety of wheat as it was when you were a kid. It's not, I assure you. It's a different variety of wheat. Why? Because the pests and diseases are always mutating and they're always changing. They're always mounting better offenses against a wheat variety. So there's a constant turnover in the fields of these varieties. Great. But where do these new varieties come from? They come from the genetic diversity, the gene pool, the diversity of the old varieties of wheat. And what I learned was that we were losing that diversity, losing it permanently, as in extinction. None of the people that were friends of mine understood that problem. I had people who, a couple of people I co-authored a book with on the world food crisis and food security that said, oh, Cary, you know, you're on a different wavelength than we are, and that's not a real problem. We parted ways over that issue.
And they thought the real problem then was amount of food and feeding people?
No, they thought the real problem was control over food systems, that we didn't have a problem with the amount. We had a problem with distribution and power in the agricultural systems. They were very much focused on developing countries. So I decided, well, I think this really is a big issue, and began to work on it. So to get back to your question, there were two problems that immediately occurred, and one was, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to educate the general public about this problem? Well, yes, but that's not easy to do. I would approach media outlets, magazines, Harper's, Atlantic, and various other, about this, and TV and such. And the reaction was always, we don't think this is a problem. Or if this is a problem, why have we never heard about it before? And I had several responses to that I kept to myself, like, well, maybe you're not smart enough to think about this, or maybe you're hearing it for the first time. That's not my problem, if you'll just listen. But that's a big task. So in the end, in terms of audience and how to get the idea across, I did something that a boy from Memphis sought not to do, which was a friend, colleague of mine and I went to the Food and Agriculture Organization at the UN in Rome, Italy. We got credentials as media, if I remember right. I was promising to write an article for some tiny little publication about this. And we went in and basically tried to create the issue. So we went into a meeting of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, FAO, and essentially started to talk to delegates about this particular issue with the goal of getting something in the final report of this meeting that would allow us to fight another day. In other words, it would be on the agenda for the next meeting, and there would be some decision maybe to be made along the way. So that was just the beginning of what we tried to do, and we succeeded in that.
You know, if anybody in here, some of us study social movements, and this is just classic social movement case study here, where you think about how does an issue end up being on the agenda, all the things that aren't on an agenda and what is on an agenda, and how sometimes one person really does start to get it on the agenda. But I'm curious how you framed it to get it to resonate, because I could imagine you could go in there and tell, that, say this is an issue for human rights, and it might have fallen flat. What year was that, by the way? That might matter.
1979.
Okay.
So I suppose theoretically we could have chosen to go to quite a few different UN agencies if we had wanted to pursue the UN path. I had already testified in Congress, or around that time I was testifying in Congress on this problem, but nobody there was paying much attention. They still don't. So, you know, one could have gone to UNEP, the Environment Program in Nairobi. One could have gone to one of the UN agencies in Geneva, or maybe the UN in New York. But each one of those different UN agencies has a different culture around it and a different set of issues that are sort of legitimate for them to think about and work on. Agriculture seemed to be the one, and obviously this is an agricultural issue, and we framed it as a food security and to some extent a conservation issue.
Okay. Did any of the, this is self-serving because I study population, but I'm thinking about the 1960s and 70s coming up to 79 with concerns about food crisis in India and population growth and population bomb. Do you think any of those historical circumstances and pre-Reagan, that era of the Cold War, do you think that facilitated this issue getting on the agenda? I mean, if it had been 89, would it have been a different outcome?
Yeah. Well, I think certainly the food crisis of having watched babies starve to death on TV in Ethiopia, for example, and we were going to have another food crisis, a little bit less severe than in the early 70s, but around the mid-80s in Ethiopia. I visited Ethiopia in '85. So that was in the air. Population, not so much, not at FAO in Rome.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it's interesting to think about how the different cultures of the organizations, you were able to kind of contain the issue, it sounds like then, and keep your focus on the agriculture by going through FAO.
Yeah, and we were also very conscious that we needed a set forum in which to discuss this issue. So what did we go talk to delegates about in 1979? We talked to them about two things. We had two issues. I mean, two real proposals we wanted them to push. One was we thought there needed to be an international treaty on plant genetic resources. That was something they were kind of used to. It's a UN agency, you negotiate treaties. And the second was we needed a forum where that issue could be discussed in a focused way. So we proposed that there be a commission, an ongoing permanent commission on plant genetic resources. And we thought if we could get that created, then wow, what are they going to do every time they meet? They're going to talk about our issue, which in 1981 they decided A, to have a commission on genetic resources, and B, they decided they would start to negotiate a treaty, which in its first rendition ended up being a very light, non-legally binding treaty, but later became a treaty.
Well, on treaties, I think for people who aren't familiar with the process, you think the outcome always should probably be a treaty. And if you have a treaty, that somebody should ratify it and implement it. But what I heard you just say was that it was a victory to just have the issue discussed. So can you talk a little bit about why somebody would want just to have an issue discussed without the treaty being the end-all be-all? Why is that a marker of success?
Well, we didn't actually know where we were going with this. We continually got farther than we thought we were going to get, which was to have the door shut on us. In fact, if I can digress, the door really was shut on me one time. There was an international, it was called an International Technical Conference on Crop Diversity. And my big hero was chairing that, scientific heroes chairing that conference. I went to the meeting in Rome, and because the powers that be at FAO didn't really like for this young kid from Memphis messing around with the delegates, didn't like that 2 years earlier, they actually stopped me at the door and said, well, you can't go in. I said, well, every once in a while, if somebody pushes me that way, I will push back. And I said, well, I think it's going to be better for you if you let me in than if you don't let me in. And they went and talked to the chair, and the chair said, let him in. And the funny part about that story was that was the third International Technical Conference. It was actually a political conference, but they call a lot of things technical in the UN. I was actually the chair of the next technical conference about 10 years later.
It's a lesson to learn.
So, yeah. But we didn't know where things were going, so we really just wanted to live to fight another day, and we did think that if we had a forum where countries could get together to talk about these issues, that good things would happen, if only because so many countries were paying no attention whatsoever to this. So, for example, let me just cite the United States. I went out to see our biggest seed bank, our national seed bank. This is the Fort Knox of seeds. This is probably, if you'd have to say that the United States has one building that contains something of greater value than anything else in the country, I would make an argument it's this building, because it's where we have our seed collection that underpin American agriculture. When I visited, I talked to the director. I said, well, how many politicians have come to visit this place? None, he says. Not even the local congressman? No. So not even our country was aware of this problem. And so being allowed in the room with ministers of agriculture and their representatives to talk about this issue seemed to me like an opportunity where there would be a ripple effect, and you would begin to see action taking place in different countries. And we did see that.
As you've talked, you've mentioned different roles that you've had, and we know that where you stand depends on where you sit. There's so many actors on the stage in international politics. There's business and intergovernmental organizations like the UN, non-governmental organizations that are kind of local, and then international ones. There's scientists and scholars, and you even in this particular story you were just telling, we're talking about being a scientist there. In what of those roles did you feel that you had the most influence? Well, can you tell me a little bit about how those different actors on that stage interact to give us a policy outcome? And which ones have the bigger voices?
The role I liked the best was towards the end of my career when I was the head of an international organization, and I was...
That sounds like it would be a really nice role. So
yeah, I guess, you're going to have one. So I had I was now employed by the UN. I had diplomatic status, which I used to tell people that gave me the ability to ignore the traffic laws in Rome just like every other Italian citizen was ignoring them. So I enjoyed that role a lot. I spent two periods of my life working at the UN. And in the first one, much of what we've talked about so far, I was sort of in an advocacy role. But then I was hired by the UN to oversee a project which was to put together their first report on the state of the world's genetic diversity. So this is the first time the UN had ever assessed what's going on out there and what do we have. And closely allied with that was a global plan of action for conserving it. So I do remember when I made the shift from sort of advocacy to the UN, I had a number of friends in the advocacy world, needless to say, that said, oh, this is great, Cary, you're in position now. You can help us, put your finger on the scales here. And I said, no, you don't get it. I grew up in a family where my father was a lawyer and then a judge. And that taught me a lot about roles and the legitimacy of roles and the integrity of roles. If you play your role with integrity. And so my job there was a level playing field. Create a level playing field, and we had, I mean, I did have some authority, and I could do some things. I had some leeway as an actor, and that leeway I used to have what I think was, well, what the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation in Sweden once said was the most participatory, bottom-up negotiating process ever in the UN history. So I was, able to do that. But my last role I really enjoyed a lot because it was, instead of overseeing a big research project, and then a global plan, which was a lot of negotiation. We, at the very end, 150 countries formally agreed to this plan, and there are a lot of stories one could tell about how that happened. But it still wasn't quite concrete enough for me, so my last job, which was to be the head of the Global Crop Diversity Trust, was something I really enjoyed because it was just very concrete, and it was extremely challenging because this was a unique organization that was mandated by the UN to do something. It had a very strange governance structure, and well, to sort of be blunt about the challenge, our tiny little organization was entrusted by the UN, you should laugh when I tell you this, with constructing a global system for the conservation of genetic diversity and funding it in perpetuity. And I had spent already, 30 years working in this area. So I thought I knew pretty much everything. I've been to more seed banks than any person alive. I remember the first day I walked in the office at the UN. There was already a secretary there. She had cleaned this office. It was spotless. It had a few pens on the desk and a couple of those little yellow pads, sticky things. And she said, "Here, welcome." And she went out and shut the door. And I looked out the window. I could see the Roman Colosseum down the street. That's cool. Yeah. And then I thought, oh my God, what do I do? Because I was cool with the idea. I knew how to conserve crop diversity. Mostly you collect seeds and you freeze them. But a global system for doing that? And in perpetuity, I thought, I don't know if anyone in the world that has a job that says, that in their job description says, comma, in perpetuity. So that was a get serious about life moment.
Well, and when you're saying this, I depending on how much people who are here with us today know about how the sausage gets made, when you're thinking about funding it, when you're thinking about the global system, it's a game changer because you're bringing in now all the really powerful countries, the nation-state governments, and you're asking some of them and other people, but for money. So can you tell us a little bit about the political workings of how these different nation-states and their interests domestically end up conflicting with what you wanted to do globally?
Yeah. Well, at various points in my career, I found that, I had to deal with all different groupings of countries and individual countries. And you would think that, to some extent, countries act rationally, and they have certain interests, and they pursue those interests. Not really.
No, I teach my students that they do, so I don't know.
Not always. So they would, delegates would come to meetings, and as the head of a quasi-UN organization, I would go to those meetings. And some of them didn't have a clue of what they were doing. Some of them came with instructions from the Capitol. In some cases, I would have a discussion with the delegate and try to educate them about what their country had said the last time so that they would be up to steam. And there were individual peculiarities of delegates that sometimes didn't match up at all with what you thought that country ought to be about. So friendships would develop between delegates of countries that might be about to go to war with each other. But my experience in the end, there's a quote that I almost always use, and all my friends are tired of hearing me quote this, but since I haven't used it today. There was a Nobel Prize winner, John Hume, Nobel laureate, peace laureate of Northern Ireland, and he said that victories and solutions are not the same thing. Think about current American politics. Think about international politics. In what situation is a victory the same thing as a solution? In a deeply polarized country or world, there are very few victories that are actually solutions. So when you get to a UN situation, in an ideal world, everybody comes, the delegates come, and they represent their interest, and you begin to work things out. But whose interest is it? Who comes with the instructions, pay attention to what everybody else is saying. Don't try to beat them. Don't try to have a victory over them. But try to figure out what the solution is here. And in my field, in my experience, there was really only one country that consistently came with delegates who sat there and tried to listen to what everybody else was saying and trying to figure out, what can we put together here that will actually work, that'll get everybody singing from the same song sheet. There's only one. So
Norway?
it was Norway.
Okay, just checking.
It was Norway. Yeah.
What is it about Scandinavia? They're so nice. Why are they so nice?
I don't know.
Give us the real international politics behind this.
Yeah, I think it's partially cultural. I think it's
What
very
is
much
it, though,
cultural.
that, I mean, to really ask it more seriously, there are some countries in the world that when they go sit at that negotiating table, we know that they represent their national interest.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then there are some countries that go and they have a much more comprehensive view.
Mhm. Yeah.
What changes that? Can you change that for a country?
I don't know. I remember overhearing or being part of a discussion between the Norwegian delegate and the Canadian delegate, and they were talking about money. That drives almost everything. And how much would countries be obliged to pay into this treaty mechanism that we were negotiating? And the Canadian delegate said, well, if there's anything that would get me fired back home, it would be to agree to some mechanism where we have to pay money. And the Norwegian responded by saying, if there's anything that would get me fired going back home, would be that I would agree to treaty provisions that wouldn't include Norway paying its fair share to make the whole thing actually work. And that was, I mean, if you spent 30 years in the UN, that's kind of astonishing.
That's very astonishing.
Well, that and any kind of restrictions on whaling would have also gotten him fired. But anyway.
Right.
Yeah, everybody's got their thing. I mean, you just got to find it. Well, you mentioned something a second ago that we were talking about in class today, some of my students, and I didn't expect you to bring it up, but now I'm going to. It's this as fostering peace. So we talk about environmental security, and we mentioned food security already. We talk about this as a problem and that it can be a national security issue, and that's how we can get attention for it, or human security issue, and starving children, that's how we get attention. But to flip the script and see this as an opportunity for countries that might otherwise not get along at all to actually build peace and build trust and cooperation, that was surprising to hear you say. So did you see this work as a peace building forum?
Yeah,
Can you give
absolutely.
me examples of that?
Yeah, I think that typically it's very easy to beat up on the UN because you see their failures. You don't often see their successes. Those are more private. And it is a bureaucracy. It is a bureaucracy. I mean, in a good week, I got 2 days to do my work, and the other 3 were fighting the bureaucracy, And there was a joke that went around at FAO. It's the big building is located across the street from the Circus Massimo, the Circus Maximus in Rome. It's a huge building. And the joke is that a tourist stops an FAO staff member going in and says, "What is this?" And the staff member says, "Oh, this is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. "Ah, how many people work there?" "Oh, about 20%. And that would be the, so that was, and that was pretty much, kind of true. But what I found was that you had to, there were shortcuts, and there were some countries that sometimes pursued shortcuts and really aggressively pursued victories over solutions. But I don't know why, but this one example comes through of something that happened. It was my first tour of duty with the UN, so to speak, and I mentioned that my job, as I saw it, was to create a level playing field and to have a country-driven process. So we were having regional meetings. There's 7 regional groups at FAO in Rome: North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, Near East, Africa. And we had announced quite formally in a formal UN meeting that any country could go as an observer to the regional meeting of any other region that they weren't in. Great. So I was at a regional meeting. This is my project. And I was at the regional meeting in Europe. Now guess what? Israel is a member of the European group. The reason is, can't be a member of the Near East group. So the Israeli delegate came up to me and she kind of jokingly said, "Well, Cary, you said that any country could go to any group meeting as an observer." I said, "Yeah." She kind of laughed. She said, "Well, I don't think you'd ever send me an invitation to go to the Near East meeting." And I somewhat naively said, "Do you want an invitation? If you do, I'm sending it." And she said, "You'll never do that." So I called my office up in Rome. The meeting was outside of Rome. I said, "Drop an invitation on letterhead, fax it to me." And the next morning I gave it to her. She started crying.
Oh, wow.
I went back to Rome. I briefed my boss, who was from Libya, about this. He hit the roof. He was a great guy and a great boss, but this was sort of against reality in the UN system. He said, "Withdraw the invitation." I said, "I'm not doing it." He said, "I'm ordering you to withdraw the invitation." So, still not doing it. We said that we would allow this, and that's what we're going to have. So in the end, we had the meeting in the Near East. We had it in Tunisia. And we had to negotiate a little bit of a dance. So the Israeli delegate was not at the table because an observer is not at the table, it's sitting behind. And Syria was the big problem. And so, and Israel and Syria had not been in the same meeting since, I don't know, decades. And the Syrian couldn't be in the same meeting with the Israeli delegate. So the deal we negotiated finally was that the meeting would start without the Israeli delegate there. After an hour or so, the Israeli delegate would come in, and the Syrian delegate would get up and leave. No big fanfare. And then 30 minutes later, the Syrian would come back. And after that, and that happened, and then they were in the same room. There wasn't a war, and everybody got along. And I saw cases like that where people, the individuals representing their countries, they didn't want to cause trouble. They actually wanted to get along with other people. You know, it's really more the capital issue, that the geopolitics. At this level, people wanted to solve, they wanted to make some progress. They wanted to deal with things.
Do you think the issue itself helped too? I mean, who can be against, it's like inoculating babies. Oh, let's try, everybody can get on board with this kind of issue. Do you think these environmental issues really could be a catalyst for larger cooperation? Or do you see them as just as politically divisive as others?
It's a little bit of both, you know, because I think we could have gotten the technical people in the room and made an international treaty in a week or two rather than however long it was, 10 or 15 years of negotiating. It would have been a lot easier. But you need buy-in, and you need buy-in from the capitals. And so it becomes very political, and it makes it difficult sometimes on a technical level. When we were negotiating the international treaty, there was a little working group. At that point, I was no longer in the UN. I was representing now a large consortium of international agricultural research institutions. So we had a technical group, should have been technical, working to figure out which crops would be covered under the treaty. It wasn't going to be all of them. And that was a political issue. And I remember one country sent a very high-ranking Politico person from the capital who didn't know a whole lot about the science. So we were talking about, okay, wheat is going to be in the treaty. What does the word wheat mean? Because there are many, many different species of wheat. I mean, we're not talking about varieties. That's another issue. There might be 150, 200,000 varieties of wheat, but maybe there are hundreds species or something. And we were talking about genus and genera and various things. And finally, this delegate said, Mr. Chairman, I just have to ask this question. What's the difference between genus and genera? And this is a technical group. And somebody, I wish I knew who it was because I'd give them a lot of credit, in the back of the room shouted out one because the difference is between singular and plural. But they didn't know that.
What an advertisement
So,
for liberal arts. Right?
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, so, you know, one has to learn in these settings how to talk with people and figure out, well, where are they coming from and what's their level of scientific sophistication.
Well, and you know, it's interesting to see, we've mentioned scientists and the role of scholars, role of advocates, government, intergovernmental organizations, but there's one that's missing and it's kind of glaring. What is the role of the private sector in all of this? And it may have changed over time, but that would be interesting to know as well. Where, you know, is it money? Is it buy-in? Do they react or are they proactive?
It was almost invisible.
okay.
I've never been involved in a UN process, and I spent, you know, a good part of 40 years hanging around these kind of things where the private sector had much influence at all, or much presence at all.
Not even pressuring delegates for certain positions?
No, well, yeah, a little bit. A little bit with the U.S. government and a little bit, I would say, with the Swiss government maybe because of just some quirks about intellectual property rights. But the big issues for the private sector had to do with A, intellectual property rights, and B, they just wanted a clear rule system. They sort of didn't care what the terms of the treaty were at the end of the day. They just wanted to know that everything was settled, and then they'd work it into their business model. So, you know, I had good relations with the private sector, but they were not influential.
Interesting. wonder if that's a missed opportunity or it's just the nature of the issue.
I think in this particular issue, they saw their interest in very short-term ways.
Mm-hmm.
So they use genetic resources as a raw material for their plant breeding program, and they think they're okay if they've got on the shelf whatever diversity they need for the next 10 years. And all of them do. All of them think that. But talk to them about in perpetuity, for example, or 20 years down the road. No, that's not of interest, with one exception in the United States. One seed company was really seeing things long-term, and that was because they had a culture that was very different. It was the seed company founded by Henry Wallace, the former Vice President of the United States. So they saw things quite differently, but the others, no. Not a big deal.
So we're just going to ask a few more, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody else. When I look at some of the successes that happened, I notice there's a little bit of a cluster in the 1990s. And so with my perspective, it makes me wonder if there was something about this period after the end of the Cold War, but before the world is focused on terrorism in the 90s, or all the explosion of ethnic conflict. Do you think any of those kinds of historical circumstances paved the way for some of these things to be solidified in the 90s?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't know. In my experience, the negotiations and such at FAO were in a little cocoon, and they seemed a little bit insulated from all this. In fact, I think it was a throwback. The politics I saw at the UN in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s was really kind of north-south.
Okay.
It was G77, the developing countries versus the developed countries, and it didn't seem to have moved on very much from that. I think there's still some of that
Yeah, certainly when you think about
in
climate
that
and-
forum.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
Yeah, and so I think, I don't know, we have to, you have to see things from the perspective of some of these delegates. And I realized when I was working there that some of these delegates were just trying to look after what was in their own best self-interest, not country interest, personal interest sometimes. And that was very real.
So if you think about all of your decades of work on this issue,
Yeah.
how would you define the problem today? Is it different from what it was when we started our conversation and we said what motivated you to get involved?
I think we still have some of the same problems we had in the beginning. One thing I'm grateful you haven't talked about a lot is the global seed vault, because I get asked that question all the time. We do have an international treaty that was a step forward, but I've found that having an international treaty is like having a stop sign at the end of your street. It really depends on whether the cars actually obey the stop sign or not, as to whether it's effective. And what I've found internationally is that, and I could name names of countries that get into negotiations like this and sign up. It now becomes the force of law, and an international treaty means that the country that's a party to that treaty is obliged to make their internal laws and regulations consistent with the treaty and to follow it. Doesn't happen.
The sovereignty thing is just...
There are a lot of countries that, in my field, that still think they're sitting on genetic gold mines. They don't want to do what the treaty says, which is to fully and freely exchange those genetic resources. And you can't enforce it easily. Why? Because do you really think that the United States is going to raise hell with India about the fact that India is not abiding by a treaty on crop diversity?
I do not.
Bigger fish to fry. They're not doing it. So it really depends on creating trust and goodwill and trying to bring the community together. And there's no shortcut for that. And that's what we still have to do.
So what are the competing priorities today? I mean, it's 2018, we're going into 2019. When you try to get traction on this issue, what are you up against?
Well, I think in my last job, the big challenge was, what's your vision of a global plan, a structure, a global system for putting all this together? And I think, if I'm proud of anything, it was of sort of cracking that nut and figuring out what that meant. But sometimes, countries see that they want to be free riders, and their interest is better served by not following those rules. So I think that we have certain elements of a workable global system. One is the seed vault near the North Pole. One is the international treaty, and one is the Crop Diversity Trust, where I used to work, which is structured as an endowment fund and has a lot of money in the bank and uses that income to pay the conservation cost in seed banks and in perpetuity. So those elements are there, and I think they really just need to be built upon.
So are you hopeful?
Well, I am actually. I was less hopeful in the beginning than I am now. Mm-hmm.
Then we will be hopeful too. We will trust you on this and be hopeful.
Yeah, why not?
We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to see if anybody wanted to ask a question for Dr. Fowler. Yes, sir.
Joe.
Where do you get the money for the funding for your seed vault, number one, and are you still needing money for the seed vault?
Well, the seed vault funding was some of the easiest funding I've ever gotten. That was talking Norway into paying the entire bill. So that was good. And when we designed the facility, I chaired the committee that did the feasibility study and designed it. We wanted a facility that would essentially work forever and be sustainable. That's another one of those words that twixt the cup in the lip. And I guess the breakthrough in that was figuring out that sustainable meant cheap, actually. It meant simple and cheap. So we wanted to design it very simply so that fewer things could go wrong with it. If it were really high tech, all kinds of stuff could break down. If it's simple, less breaks down. And if it's cheap, governments won't pull the plug on it, or we won't pull the plug on it. The Global Crop Diversity Trust is funding it. So it was built for about $9 million. In today's dollars, $6 million. Not a lot. Cost a couple $100,000 to operate a year. Very cheap. The endowment for the Global Crop Diversity Trust was a different matter. That was a little more difficult to assemble, particularly when I inherited the organization. It was only months old at that point, and we had no track record. None. Zero. So I had a job of building up a huge endowment fund when I didn't have a thing to show for what the organization could do. And my task then, or as I saw it, my argument then was that we can do something, I would say to the governments, we can do something better, more efficient, more effective than you yourself can do. And we know you want to solve this problem. We know you want to conserve this resource. We can do it better. Why can we do it better? Because we can look at the whole playing field. And instead of creating an entitlement program for seed banks where every seed bank just gets money, we'll figure out where the critical ones are, where the unique samples that need conservation, and we'll give money to them and we'll hold them to account, et cetera, et cetera. So most of that money came from governments. We did get a big grant from the Gates Foundation, and a lot of people have the same reaction to Gates as they do to the private sector. What were the strings attached? What does this rich guy want in return for giving you money? And the answer was nothing. I mean, it was amazing. I realized that there was a guy in the Gates Foundation that was investigating the possibility of the Gates Foundation giving money in the agriculture field. I wrote him an email, He wrote back. I got the impression it was a "don't call us, we'll call you" kind of response, but I thought he left the door open a crack, so I wrote him back again. Then he really closed the door. I said, well, that's it. Okay, that's it. And then one day out of the blue, I got a call from the Gates Foundation, and the guy said, "Cary, we're thinking about giving you $20 million, maybe more." And I called a staff meeting, and I said, "Stop whatever you're doing." We had to write a concept note. And at the end, we presented them with a proposal for $20 million, doing what we thought needed to be done, which at that point was rescue all of this diversity that we thought was really unique but endangered in developing countries. And their response was, "That's a good proposal, but make it for $30 million. And I said, "I don't think we can. There's not enough to do that we can responsibly do and oversee for $30 million. 20, maybe a little bit more." He said, "Do the best you can." I wrote them another proposal for $22 million. He said, "Cary," I said, "the only way we can get this to 30 is if you give money to our endowment." He said, "Bill doesn't like that. It's giving money from his endowment to your endowment. That doesn't make any sense to him." I said, "Well, then we have to turn it down." He said, "Nobody's ever turned down money from us." I said, "Well, you got to understand, we're a new organization. We have the biggest asset we have is our integrity. We have to be honest about this. We have to do what we think we can do, and we're not going to bite off more and overpromise and then fail and everything." And they said, "Oh gosh, you're breaking us. We're going to have to go to Bill and say this, and it's not going to be a good day for us as a staff member." And well, I can't do it. And they called me back about 3 or 4 weeks later, and they said, "We're giving you $30 million, 22 for what you want, and we're going to put the rest in your endowment fund." And we were the first major agricultural grant. And what that did was, and it also taught me one other lesson, which I'll just say very briefly. I learned a lot from the Gates Foundation because they demanded that you quantify everything. It wasn't about doing good deeds. And I had that experience at the trust too, because everybody said, "Oh, you're an endowment, just give us money. We have seeds, send money." I didn't want to do that. So they, we really had to focus, and the Gates Foundation made us quantify everything we were doing. So we said, okay, we're going to rescue 150,000 unique crop varieties. And the conversation right before that was when I tried to explain that I didn't want to quantify it. I said, "That's going to be a guess on top of an estimate." They said, "Cary, you did the State of the World report for the UN?" I said, "Yeah, you're the most qualified to make a guess.
Yeah.
So do it. If you don't do it, you're not getting any money." So that was convincing.
I feel like your scientific knowledge melded with your Southern charm perfectly
Well,
to get
I don't
you
know.
that.
Something happened. Something happened.
Well, just this one more. Good.
Can you talk a little bit about the effects of climate change on the seed vault?
Yeah. It's a question about climate change. I think climate change is the biggest biggest challenge human beings face internationally. I think we face other unique challenges in the United States have more to do with institutions and democracy and such. But internationally, it's climate change, which is going to have a tremendous impact on agricultural productivity. It's going to shift production areas. It's going to, we're going to have unique assemblages of species living and breathing together that we've never seen before because pests and diseases and crops are migrating. I can go on and on about this. And by the way, I think last month, when the records are finally in from NOAA, will be probably the 405th consecutive month in which the global average temperature for that month, September, exceeded the 20th century average for Septembers 405 consecutive months. That's change. That's trend. So that's going to happen. It is happening, and that's why we need crop diversity. If we don't have that diversity, we don't have the raw material for evolution, well, it's like any other species. You know, I've always thought that extinction was a process, not an event. It's not when the last individual dies, it's when the species loses the ability to evolve, because all the species have to evolve. The seed vault question is really easy. I'll make it brief. The seed vault is in the way back in a tunnel, 130 meters into the mountain. A number of you have been there, Mary, Barron. The temperature back there is -5, more or less, Celsius. And the ideal temperature for freezing seeds is, for long term, is -18. So we artificially cool it down from -18 to -5. It's still going to be freezing 200 years from now, worst case scenario for climate change. But let's say it drops 2 degrees. So it's only -3 back there naturally instead of -5. Then we'll freeze it from -3 to -18 instead of -5 to -18. So that's the biggest long-term impact. Short-term, we got some water coming in at the front of the tunnel from the summer melt because the permafrost is not perma anymore. So the Norwegians are spending an incredible amount of money, more than they spent to build the vault in the first place, to make a watertight tunnel that will solve that problem.
And the death knell will be political once we get to the extinction of the species. That's a scary thought. Thank you so much for this conversation, and I invite all of our guests to have some refreshments and get to know you as well. So
Sure.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.